It was supposed to be an ordinary day. The sun was shining, cars were speeding down the busy highway, and everything seemed normal. But for one woman, what began as a routine drive turned into an unforgettable nightmare. A shocking moment captured on camera showed police officers dragging a black woman out of her car. The scene was chaotic. Flashing lights, raised voices, and the sound of sirens filled the air. The woman was visibly shaken, but she remained defiant. Little did anyone know what happened next would leave everyone speechless. As the officers tried to subdue her, she repeatedly asked, "What did I do wrong?" Her voice trembled, but her resolve didn't waver. The tension was palpable as bystanders gathered, some recording the unfolding events on their phones. It seemed like another incident destined to fuel debates about race, power, and justice. But this was no ordinary story. The moment took an unexpected turn when a mysterious figure arrived on the scene. Calm and composed, he stepped out of a sleek black car. He walked with confidence, his very presence demanding attention. The officers froze, their expressions shifting from authority to shock. The bystanders whispered among themselves, trying to piece together who this man was and why he commanded such immediate respect. And then the bombshell dropped. The man was the woman's husband, and his identity was something no one could have predicted. What started as an alarming encounter with law enforcement quickly became a story of resilience, love, and the power of identity. This wasn't just a tale of conflict. It was a moment that would expose deeper truths about assumptions, biases, and the human spirit. The incident, though deeply personal, resonated far beyond the highway where it occurred. It sparked conversations across the nation, challenging people to confront their own beliefs and the systems that shape society. But before we reveal who her husband is and why his presence changed everything, let's rewind and understand how it all began. What led to this dramatic confrontation? Who was this woman? And why did the police stop her in the first place? And most importantly, what does this story teach us about the world we live in today? Stay with us as we unravel this gripping narrative. A tale that starts with injustice but ends with a twist that no one saw coming. It was late afternoon on a warm summer day, the kind where the golden sunlight dances across the tops of cars as they zoom down the freeway. The sky was a brilliant blue, with only a few fluffy clouds hanging lazily overhead. The highway was bustling with the sounds of commuters heading home, families out for weekend trips, and the occasional rumble of a motorcycle zipping past. Among the sea of vehicles, a sleek silver sedan made its way steadily in the right lane. It wasn't flashy or extravagant, just a modest car that blended in with the flow of traffic. Inside the car sat Melanie Carter, a woman in her mid-30s with an air of quiet confidence. She was dressed neatly in a light blue blouse and black slacks, professional yet comfortable. Melanie had just wrapped up her day at work as a community organizer, a job she was deeply passionate about. She had spent the afternoon leading a workshop on empowerment and equality, a topic close to her heart. Her car's passenger seat held evidence of her work, a folder bursting with notes, pamphlets, and a reusable water bottle she carried everywhere. Melanie had an aura of calm, even when she was on the move. She kept her hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel and glanced occasionally at her rearview mirror, humming along softly to a playlist of her favorite 90s R&B hits. As she drove, she thought about her plans for the evening. Dinner with her husband, some much-needed rest, and maybe a little time to read her new novel. Life wasn't perfect, but she had worked hard to build a sense of stability and purpose. But stability has a way of shifting when you least expect it. Melanie noticed the flashing red and blue lights in her rearview mirror before she heard the wail of the siren. Her stomach sank. She glanced at her speedometer. She was well within the speed limit. Confused but determined to remain composed, she signaled and pulled over to the shoulder of the highway. The grass on the side of the road swayed gently in the breeze as the squad car came to a stop behind her. Two officers stepped out of the vehicle. Both were dressed in standard police uniforms, their belts weighed down with radios, handcuffs, and other tools of their trade. The lead officer, Officer Mitchell, was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his 40s with a stern expression and a no-nonsense demeanor. His partner, Officer Daniels, was younger, possibly in his late 20s, with an anxious energy that suggested he was still finding his footing in the force. The two walked toward Melanie's car with a measured pace, their sunglasses reflecting the sunlight. Melanie rolled down her window and placed both hands on the steering wheel, just as she had been taught during countless conversations about how to stay safe during traffic stops. Her voice was calm as she greeted the officers. "Good afternoon, officers. Is everything okay?" she asked, her tone polite but tinged with unease. Officer Mitchell peered into the car, his eyes scanning the interior. "License and registration," he said flatly, without offering an explanation for the stop. Melanie nodded, reaching slowly for her glove compartment. "May I ask why I'm being stopped?" she inquired. "You can ask," Officer Daniels replied, his voice tight. "But let's see your license and registration first." To understand Melanie's reaction, you have to understand her story. She wasn't just any commuter. She was someone who had spent her life navigating and challenging systems of power. Raised in a tight-knit community in Atlanta, Georgia, Melanie grew up with parents who emphasized the importance of education and resilience. Her father, a retired firefighter, and her mother, a school teacher, instilled in her a deep sense of justice and compassion. As a young adult, Melanie channeled her passion into activism. She studied sociology in college and eventually became a community organizer, dedicating herself to causes like affordable housing, racial equality, and police accountability. She was no stranger to tense situations or difficult conversations, but this was different. Today, she wasn't standing in front of a crowd or advocating for someone else. Today, she was the one being scrutinized. Officer Mitchell was a veteran on the force with over 15 years of experience. Known for being strict and by the book, he had a reputation for being tough but fair. At least, that's what his peers said. However, he had also been the subject of a few internal reviews for complaints about his handling of traffic stops involving people of color. None of the complaints had ever resulted in formal disciplinary action, but they lingered like a shadow over his career. Officer Daniels, on the other hand, was a rookie. He had joined the force less than 2 years ago and still carried the weight of trying to prove himself. Daniels often deferred to Mitchell, who he saw as a mentor, even when he wasn't entirely comfortable with the way Mitchell handled certain situations. Today was no exception. As Melanie handed over her license and registration, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Officer Mitchell took the documents without a word and returned to the squad car, leaving Officer Daniels to stand by her window. "Ma'am, do you know why you were pulled over?" Daniels asked, his tone softer than Mitchell's. "No, I don't," Melanie replied. "I wasn't speeding and I wasn't on my phone. I'd really like to understand what's going on." Daniels hesitated, glancing back at Mitchell in the squad car. "We'll explain in a moment," he said, his response feeling more like a way to buy time than an actual answer. After what felt like an eternity, Mitchell returned. His expression was unreadable as he handed back her documents. "Step out of the car, ma'am," he said abruptly. Melanie's heart raced. "Step out? Why? I haven't done anything wrong." "Ma'am, step out of the car," Mitchell repeated, his voice firmer this time. "I have a right to know why," Melanie insisted, her voice shaking but steady. "Am I under arrest? What's the charge?" Mitchell's patience seemed to wane. "We're not going to ask again. Step out of the car now." The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Melanie took a deep breath, weighing her options. She could comply, but the lack of explanation made her question the legitimacy of the stop. Still, she decided to remain calm and cooperative. As she opened the door and stepped onto the side of the highway, the officers moved closer. Mitchell reached for her arm, but Melanie pulled back instinctively. "Don't touch me," she said firmly. By now, a few cars had slowed down to see what was happening. A small crowd began to gather on the shoulder, some pulling out their phones to record. Among them was a young man named Jamal, a college student who often documented incidents involving law enforcement. Sensing that something was amiss, he positioned himself at a safe distance and began filming. "Hey, is everything okay?" Someone from the crowd called out. Melanie turned toward the voice, her eyes pleading for support. "I don't know why they're doing this," she said. "I haven't done anything wrong." The situation was spiraling, and the officers seemed increasingly agitated. But what neither Melanie nor the officers knew was that her husband, Jonathan, had just received a frantic call from a friend who had seen the traffic stop. He was on his way, and his arrival would change everything. The tension hung in the air like a thunderstorm about to break. Melanie stood on the side of the highway, her heart pounding as she faced the two officers. Cars zoomed past, some drivers glancing curiously at the unfolding scene, while others honked in annoyance at the disruption. The small crowd of bystanders had grown slightly larger, their murmurs and camera phones adding another layer of pressure. "Ma'am, step over here," Officer Mitchell said, gesturing to the front of the police cruiser. His tone was sharp and commanding, a clear signal that he wasn't interested in discussion. "I'm standing right here," Melanie replied, her voice steady but firm. "I've done nothing wrong. Can you at least tell me why I was pulled over?" Officer Daniels shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flickering between Mitchell and Melanie. It was clear he wasn't fully on board with how things were escalating, but he stayed silent, deferring to his senior partner. "Ma'am, we've asked you to comply," Mitchell said, stepping closer. "If you don't, we'll have no choice but to take further action." "Further action?" Melanie repeated incredulously. "You're threatening me, but you still haven't told me what I've done. This is harassment." As the exchange continued, Melanie could feel her frustration boiling over. She glanced at the small crowd forming nearby, hoping someone would step in or call for help. The presence of witnesses gave her some reassurance, but it also added to the pressure. She couldn't afford to lose her composure, not now, not here. "Ma'am," Officer Daniels interjected, his voice softer than Mitchell's, "we're conducting an investigation. If you cooperate, this will go much smoother." "Investigation into what?" Melanie shot back. "You're not even telling me what I'm accused of. Is it a crime to drive while black?" The question hung in the air, stark and uncomfortable. Mitchell's jaw tightened, and for a moment it seemed like he was debating how to respond. Instead, he reached for his radio and muttered something into it, his words drowned out by the sound of passing cars. Daniels took a small step forward, his body language less confrontational than his partner's. "Ma'am, we just need you to answer a few questions." "No," Melanie interrupted, her voice rising. "You don't just get to drag me out of my car and humiliate me in public without giving me a reason. This is wrong, and you know it." The crowd murmured in agreement, emboldened by her defiance. A man holding a phone shouted, "Leave her alone! She hasn't done anything!" Others nodded, their cameras trained on the officers. The tipping point came when Melanie refused to step closer to the police cruiser. Frustrated, Mitchell moved abruptly, reaching for her arm. "You're resisting a lawful order," he said, his grip tightening around her wrist. "Don't touch me!" Melanie yelled, yanking her arm back. The sudden movement caused the papers in her car to scatter onto the pavement, a chaotic flurry of notes and documents. Her reaction wasn't aggressive, it was instinctive, a natural response to being manhandled. But Mitchell interpreted it differently. "That's it," he snapped. "Turn around, you're under arrest." "For what?" Melanie shouted, her voice breaking with a mix of fear and anger. "For asking questions? For standing up for myself?" Mitchell didn't answer. Instead, he pulled out a pair of handcuffs, motioning for Daniels to assist him. Daniels hesitated, his eyes darting between Melanie and the growing crowd. He knew this was spiraling out of control, but he didn't know how to stop it. The crowd erupted. "This is wrong," someone yelled. "She hasn't done anything." Another voice added, "We're recording everything." Mitchell seemed unfazed by the bystanders' protests. His focus was on Melanie, who was now visibly trembling. As he moved to cuff her, she pulled back again, her voice rising in desperation. "Stop! You're hurting me! I haven't done anything!" For Melanie, the moment felt surreal, like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Her mind raced with questions. Why is this happening to me? What did I do? How far will they go? She thought about the stories she'd heard, the names she'd chanted at protests, and the faces of victims who never got justice. Was she about to become another statistic? Tears welled up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had to stay strong, for herself and for the people watching. But the fear was undeniable, an icy grip that tightened around her chest with every passing second. Meanwhile, Daniels's face was a mask of uncertainty. He stepped forward, as if to intervene, but stopped short when Mitchell shot him a warning glance. "Daniels, stay focused," Mitchell barked. "But, sir," Daniels began, his voice faltering. "I said stay focused," Mitchell repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. The bystanders weren't silent observers anymore. They were yelling, filming, and calling for justice. Some moved closer, their voices a chorus of outrage. "This is excessive," one woman shouted. "She's not a threat." Another man added, "We're going to make sure everyone sees this." Jamal, the college student who had been filming from the start, felt his pulse quicken. He knew this footage could be important, maybe even critical. He captured every detail: Melanie's trembling hands, the scattered papers on the ground, Mitchell's clenched jaw, and Daniels's visible discomfort. Unbeknownst to everyone, help was on the way. Melanie's husband, Jonathan, was speeding toward the scene. His phone had been blowing up with calls and texts from friends who had seen the live stream. One message stood out. "Your wife needs you. Now." Jonathan's mind raced as he drove. He was a man of calm demeanor and quiet strength, but in this moment, he felt a fire he couldn't contain. He wasn't just rushing to defend his wife, he was rushing to make a statement. Back on the highway, Melanie's voice rang out above the chaos. "You're going to regret this," she said, her tone defiant despite her fear. "You don't know who I am. You don't know who my husband is." Mitchell smirked, clearly unimpressed. "It doesn't matter who you are," he said dismissively. "No one's above the law." But the crowd sensed something brewing. There was an edge to Melanie's words, a quiet confidence that hinted at more than just empty defiance. The suspense was palpable, leaving everyone, officers, bystanders, and Melanie herself, on edge. As the situation reached a boiling point, a sleek black car appeared in the distance, moving purposefully toward the scene. The roar of its engine cut through the noise, drawing the attention of everyone present. The crowd murmured, their focus shifting from the officers to the approaching vehicle. Inside the car, Jonathan clenched the steering wheel, his jaw set with determination. He knew this moment would define not just the day, but possibly the rest of their lives. As he pulled up to the scene, the energy shifted. Something was about to change. The sleek black car pulled up on the shoulder of the highway, its engine humming like a lion about to roar. The arrival of the vehicle immediately silenced the crowd, shifting the energy of the moment. Heads turned, phones zoomed in, and murmurs rippled through the onlookers. The driver's side door opened slowly, and out stepped a man who seemed to carry the weight of authority with him. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored navy blue suit with a crisp white shirt and a tie that subtly hinted at elegance. His polished black shoes caught the sunlight as he strode forward with purpose. Jonathan Carter, Melanie's husband, was a man who exuded calm confidence. But in this moment, there was a fire in his eyes that could not be ignored. As Jonathan approached the scene, the officers exchanged uneasy glances. Something about him made it impossible to dismiss his presence. The bystanders, still clutching their phones, whispered in speculation. "Who is he? Is that her lawyer? He looks important. What's going on?" Jonathan walked directly toward Melanie, his eyes locked on her tear-streaked face. He didn't shout or demand attention. His presence alone commanded it. He stood beside her, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. For the first time since the ordeal began, Melanie felt a sense of safety wash over her. "Is there a problem here, officers?" Jonathan asked, his voice calm but firm, with the slightest edge that hinted he wouldn't tolerate any further injustice. Officer Mitchell, clearly taken aback, hesitated before responding. "Sir, this is a police matter. Please step back." Jonathan didn't budge. "I'm not stepping back," he said evenly. "That's my wife you're harassing. I'd like to know the charges." The crowd gasped audibly. The officers seemed momentarily stunned, as if realizing they had grossly miscalculated the situation. It wasn't just the fact that Jonathan was standing up to them. It was who he was. "You don't recognize me, do you?" Jonathan continued, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. His words hung in the air, a challenge and a statement all at once. Officer Daniels, visibly nervous, seemed to connect the dots before Mitchell did. "Wait," he stammered. You're Jonathan Carter?" "Yes," Jonathan confirmed. "And if you're unsure why that's relevant, let me enlighten you." Jonathan Carter wasn't just a concerned husband. He was a household name in powerful circles. A renowned attorney and civil rights advocate, he had spent years fighting cases that challenged systemic racism, police misconduct, and institutional inequality. His victories had made headlines across the nation, and his influence extended beyond the courtroom. He had advised policymakers, appeared on national television debates, and authored a best-selling book on justice and reform. More importantly, Jonathan was a vocal critic of law enforcement's treatment of marginalized communities. He had litigated several high-profile cases against police departments for abuse of power and wrongful arrests. For many officers, his name alone was enough to strike a chord of caution or fear. The realization hit Mitchell like a freight train. His face betrayed a mix of disbelief and anxiety. The man standing before him wasn't just another civilian. He was someone who had the power to dismantle careers, expose misconduct, and demand accountability on a national scale. The crowd's energy shifted from confusion to empowerment. "That's Jonathan Carter," one bystander whispered, her tone filled with awe. "He's a legend," another person added. "These cops really messed up now." The officers, however, were struggling to maintain control of the situation. Mitchell's authoritative demeanor began to crack as he realized the potential fallout of the encounter. Daniels, meanwhile, looked as though he wanted to disappear altogether. Jonathan wasn't finished. He turned his attention to Mitchell, his gaze piercing. "I want to know why my wife was pulled over," he demanded. "And don't tell me it was for a broken tail light or some other flimsy excuse. I know the law better than anyone here." Mitchell opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He glanced at Daniels, silently pleading for backup, but Daniels only looked down at his shoes. "Let me make this clear," Jonathan continued. "If you can't provide a valid reason for this stop, you're violating her rights. And if you think I'm going to let that slide, you're sorely mistaken." Under the weight of Jonathan's presence, Mitchell tried to salvage what little control he had left. "Sir, we were conducting a routine traffic stop," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Routine traffic stop?" Jonathan echoed, raising an eyebrow. "Dragging a woman out of her car without explanation isn't routine. Placing her under arrest without probable cause isn't routine. Do you really want to explain this routine behavior to a judge? Or better yet, the media?" The mention of the media sent a visible shiver through Mitchell. He could feel the eyes of the crowd, the unblinking lenses of their cameras capturing every moment. His position was untenable, and he knew it. After a long pause, Mitchell finally relented. "You're free to go," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Jonathan nodded, his expression unreadable. That's what I thought. As Melanie and Jonathan returned to their car, the crowd erupted in applause. Some cheered for Jonathan's courage, while others simply celebrated a moment of justice in an unjust situation. But the incident wasn't just about one couple or one traffic stop. It was a microcosm of a much larger issue, a reflection of the systemic biases and assumptions that permeate society. For Melanie, the experience was both humiliating and enlightening. She had always known the challenges faced by Black Americans, but facing them firsthand was a stark reminder of how deeply rooted these issues were. For Jonathan, the incident reaffirmed his commitment to fighting for change, not just for his wife, but for everyone who had ever been in her position. The bystanders, too, left with a renewed sense of purpose. Seeing Jonathan stand up to the officers reminded them of the power of knowledge and advocacy. It challenged the stereotype of helplessness, often associated with marginalized communities, and showed the importance of unity and support. The entire encounter forced everyone involved, police, bystanders, and even Melanie and Jonathan, to confront the assumptions that had fueled the situation. The officers had seen a Black woman in a modest car and assumed she was an easy target. They hadn't anticipated her strength or the support she would receive. They certainly hadn't anticipated her husband being someone who could dismantle their authority with a few well-chosen words. The incident also highlighted the importance of identity and representation. Jonathan's presence wasn't just about his fame or influence, it was about what he represented. A community that refused to be silenced, a family that stood together, and a society demanding accountability. As the black sedan merged back onto the highway, Melanie reached over and took Jonathan's hand. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice filled with gratitude and love. Jonathan squeezed her hand in return. "I'll always be here for you," he replied. "But this isn't over. Not for us, and not for anyone else." True to his word, Jonathan used the incident as a catalyst for a broader conversation. Within days, the footage from the bystanders' phones went viral, sparking debates on police reform, racial profiling, and the power of knowing your rights. The story of Melanie and Jonathan Carter became a rallying cry for change, a reminder that even in moments of darkness, light can emerge. The turning point wasn't just about Jonathan's arrival, it was about the ripple effect it created. It was a moment that challenged assumptions, exposed biases, and inspired action. And in doing so, it reminded everyone that the fight for justice is far from over. The dust had barely settled on the highway when the repercussions of the incident began to ripple outward. For Melanie and Jonathan Carter, the ordeal was a deeply personal violation, but it quickly became a public spectacle. Within hours, videos of the encounter flooded social media platforms, sparking a wave of outrage, debate, and activism. For the officers involved, the fallout was swift and unavoidable, as their actions came under scrutiny from the public, their department, and even national figures. For Melanie, the experience left emotional scars that would take time to heal. The humiliation of being dragged from her car, treated as a criminal without cause, and made a public spectacle, was difficult to shake. "It's not just what they did," she later said in an interview, her voice steady but reflective. "It's what it represents. The assumption that I was dangerous or less deserving of respect simply because of the color of my skin." Jonathan, while fiercely protective of his wife, recognized the power of their story. "This isn't just about us," he said during a press conference days after the incident. "This is about a system that allows such abuse of power to go unchecked. We have the privilege and platform to speak out, but not everyone does. That's why this fight is so important." The Carters chose not to let the incident define them as victims, but rather as advocates for change. They announced plans to file a lawsuit against the police department for racial profiling and excessive use of force. using the proceeds to fund community programs aimed at educating people about their rights and promoting racial justice. For Officer Mitchell, the consequences were immediate and career-threatening. The viral video, which showed his overly aggressive behavior and refusal to provide justification for the stop, led to an internal investigation. Public pressure mounted as calls for his suspension flooded the department's phone lines and social media accounts. Officer Daniels, while less directly culpable, wasn't spared from criticism. Many questioned his inaction and failure to intervene. Complicity is just as dangerous as the act itself, one commentator wrote on Twitter, encapsulating the sentiment of many viewers. Both officers were placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation, but the damage to their reputations was already done. Mitchell's name became a trending topic on social media, accompanied by hashtags like #AccountabilityNow and #Justice for Melanie. The media quickly latched onto the story, framing it as yet another example of systemic racism and police misconduct in America. Major news outlets ran headlines like, "Traffic stop gone wrong," "Black woman harassed," "Husband exposes injustice." Civil rights attorney Jonathan Carter confronts police in viral incident. When will it end? Calls for police reform renewed after traffic stop drama. Cable news channels invited legal experts, civil rights activists, and law enforcement representatives to debate the incident, often airing clips from the bystanders' footage. Melanie and Jonathan appeared on several major programs, sharing their story and calling for broader reforms in policing. Jonathan, ever the eloquent advocate, used these opportunities to broaden the conversation. "This isn't just about one bad officer," he said during a primetime interview. "This is about a culture that allows biases to dictate actions, about training that fails to prioritize de-escalation, and about accountability systems that don't hold officers to the standards we deserve." The story also gained international attention, with outlets in Europe, Asia, and Africa covering the incident as part of a larger narrative about racial inequality in the United States. The public's reaction was overwhelmingly supportive of the Carters. Social media became a battleground of opinions, with hashtags like "Stand with Melanie" and "Justice for Carter" trending within hours. People praised Melanie's courage, Jonathan's composure, and the bystanders who had documented the encounter. "This is what systemic change looks like," one user tweeted, sharing a photo of Jonathan standing protectively beside Melanie. "We need more people like Jonathan Carter, brave, informed, and unafraid to stand up for what's right." Others used the incident to draw attention to broader issues, sharing statistics about racial disparities in traffic stops and police encounters. Activists organized rallies in support of the Carters, demanding greater accountability and transparency from law enforcement agencies. However, not everyone was on their side. Some defended the officers' actions, claiming they were just doing their job. "We don't know the full story," one critic wrote on a conservative blog. "Traffic stops are dangerous, and officers have to make quick decisions." Despite this minority opposition, the overwhelming narrative was one of support for the Carters and condemnation of the officers involved. The incident drew responses from a wide range of public figures, both real and fictional, further amplifying its impact. Former President Barack Obama tweeted, "Melanie and Jonathan Carter's story reminds us of the work that still needs to be done. We stand with them and all who demand equality and accountability." Oprah Winfrey, during an episode of her podcast, called Melanie a beacon of grace and resilience and invited the couple to share their story on her platform. LeBron James posted on Instagram, "This has to stop. Every day, someone's dignity is stripped because of the color of their skin. Salute to Jonathan Carter for standing tall." Justice for Melanie. Civil rights activist Angela Davis commented during a panel discussion, "The Carters' experience is a stark reminder of the realities that millions face, but it's also a testament to the power of knowledge and solidarity. When we stand together, we are unstoppable." For many, The incident became a rallying cry, a symbol of resilience in the face of injustice and a call to action for a better future. Melanie and Jonathan's courage, the bystanders' solidarity, and the overwhelming public support all painted a picture of hope amid adversity. But the story also served as a stark reminder of the work that remains. As Jonathan said in one of his interviews, "This isn't about vilifying individuals. It's about dismantling a system that allows incidents like this to happen over and over again, and it's about making sure no one else has to endure what Melanie did." The Carters' journey was far from over, but their story had already sparked a movement. The incident on the highway wasn't just a moment of conflict. It was a catalyst for change, one that would ripple through communities, institutions, and hearts for years to come. The incident involving Melanie Carter and the police officers was not just an isolated event. It was a microcosm of larger systemic issues deeply embedded in society. Racism, privilege, and identity were at the heart of the confrontation, reflecting patterns that have persisted for generations. Examining these themes offers an opportunity to unpack the societal structures that allow such incidents to occur and explore how both law enforcement and society can learn from this pivotal moment. The encounter between Melanie and the officers underscored the pervasive nature of systemic racism in everyday interactions. Racism isn't always explicit. More often, it manifests subtly through assumptions, biases, and unequal treatment. Melanie's experience highlighted how her identity as a Black woman placed her in a vulnerable position, where her humanity was overshadowed by stereotypes. Research shows that Black drivers are disproportionately stopped and searched by police compared to their white counterparts, despite being less likely to possess contraband. Melanie's case fits into this troubling statistic, shedding light on how racial profiling operates as a default mechanism in policing. This incident also illustrated the intersectionality of race and gender. As a Black woman, Melanie faced not only the racial biases ingrained in law enforcement practices, but also the additional layer of societal stereotypes about women of color being angry or uncooperative. These biases compounded the officer's assumptions and influenced their actions, amplifying the injustice she experienced. Privilege, in this context, is the unearned benefit of being seen as non-threatening or credible based on societal hierarchies. The stark contrast between Melanie's treatment and the way others might have been handled reveals how privilege operates in law enforcement interactions. Would the same level of aggression have been applied if Melanie were a white woman driving a luxury car? Would her husband's arrival have been met with the same deference if he lacked his reputation and authority? Jonathan Carter's presence shifted the dynamics of the situation, not just because of his identity as her husband, but because of his social capital. His profession, demeanor, and confidence allowed him to challenge the officers in a way that many others in similar situations might not have been able to. This dynamic revealed the role privilege plays in securing justice, even in moments of obvious wrongdoing. It's a privilege that should be extended to all but remains out of reach for many. Melanie and Jonathan's identities were central to the incident. For Melanie, her identity as a Black woman shaped how the officers perceived and treated her. For Jonathan, his identity as a high-profile attorney and civil rights advocate provided him with the tools to confront injustice effectively. However, the power of identity cuts both ways. It can be a source of empowerment, but it can also be weaponized against individuals, as seen in the way the officers assumed the worst about Melanie. The incident also sparked conversations about collective identity. For the Black community, it became another painful reminder of the daily struggles and systemic hurdles they face. Yet, it also became a rallying point for solidarity, activism, and hope, demonstrating the resilience and strength that emerge when individuals and communities come together to fight injustice. The officers' behavior was shaped by preconceived notions that influenced how they approached Melanie from the moment they stopped her. Without knowing her background, they treated her as a threat, escalating the situation unnecessarily. These biases weren't born in a vacuum. They stem from societal narratives that associate blackness with danger and criminality. Implicit bias training for law enforcement is a step in addressing these issues. But training alone cannot undo years of ingrained stereotypes. The biases displayed by the officers reflect a broader cultural problem where certain groups are routinely dehumanized and treated with suspicion. The officers' actions also revealed a dangerous dynamic in policing, the conflation of authority with infallibility. When Melanie questioned their motives, they interpreted her defiance as resistance rather than a legitimate plea for transparency and respect. This mindset fosters an environment where officers are more focused on asserting control than de-escalating situations. Accountability mechanisms, such as body cameras, civilian oversight boards, and community engagement programs, are crucial in addressing this issue. When officers are held to higher standards of behavior and transparency, the likelihood of such incidents decreases. Lessons learned for law enforcement. 1. Adopt de-escalation practices. The officers could have handled the situation far more effectively by employing de-escalation techniques. Instead of demanding compliance without explanation, they could have calmly explained the reason for the stop, listened to Melanie's concerns, and addressed them respectfully. De-escalation training should be mandatory and reinforced throughout an officer's career. 2. Prioritize community engagement. Building trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve is essential. Programs that encourage officers to engage with residents outside of enforcement contexts can help humanize both parties and reduce tensions. 3. Increase diversity in policing. A more diverse police force can bring a wider range of perspectives and experiences to the table, potentially reducing the impact of implicit biases. Representation matters, and efforts to recruit and retain officers from underrepresented backgrounds should be a priority. 4. Strengthen accountability. Measures. Officers who abuse their authority or act on racial biases must face meaningful consequences. This includes not only individual discipline, but also systemic reforms to ensure that such behavior isn't normalized or tolerated. Lessons learned for law enforcement. 1. Adopt de-escalation practices. The officers could have handled the situation far more effectively by employing de-escalation techniques. Instead of demanding compliance without explanation, they could have calmly explained the reason for the stop, listened to Melanie's concerns, and addressed them respectfully. De-escalation training should be mandatory and reinforced throughout an officer's career. 2. Prioritize community engagement. Building trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve is essential. Programs that encourage officers to engage with residents outside of enforcement contexts can help humanize both parties and reduce tensions. 3. Increase diversity in policing. A more diverse police force can bring a wider range of perspectives and experiences to the table, potentially reducing the impact of implicit biases. Representation matters, and efforts to recruit and retain officers from underrepresented backgrounds should be a priority. 4. Strengthen accountability. Measures. Officers who abuse their authority or act on racial biases must face meaningful consequences. This includes not only individual discipline, but also systemic reforms to ensure that such behavior isn't normalized or tolerated. For society. 1 challenge. Stereotypes. Society must confront the narratives that perpetuate racial biases. Media, education, and community initiatives can play a significant role in breaking down harmful stereotypes and fostering a culture of understanding and inclusion. 2. Empower individuals through education. Melanie and Jonathan's story highlights the importance of knowing one's rights. Public education campaigns focused on legal literacy can empower individuals to navigate encounters with law enforcement more confidently and assertively. Third, demand structural change. Advocacy and activism are essential in pushing for reforms that address the root causes of systemic racism. From policy changes to grassroots movements, sustained efforts are needed to create a more equitable society. Support marginalized voices. Amplifying the experiences and stories of marginalized communities is critical in fostering empathy and driving change. Melanie's courage in sharing her story created a platform for dialogue and reflection, a testament to the power of storytelling in social transformation. The incident on the highway was a stark reminder of the work that remains in dismantling systemic racism and reimagining policing. But it was also a moment of hope, a testament to the resilience of individuals like Melanie and Jonathan Carter and the power of collective action. As society reflects on this moment, the goal must be not just to address the immediate injustices, but to envision a world where such incidents are no longer possible. This requires a commitment to equality, empathy, and accountability from every sector of society, from law enforcement to community leaders to everyday citizens. In the words of Jonathan Carter, the fight for justice isn't a sprint, it's a marathon. It's about showing up every day, speaking truth to power, and refusing to accept anything less than dignity and respect for all. The incident that began as a routine traffic stop and escalated into an unnecessary show of force became a turning point for Melanie and Jonathan Carter. It was a moment of deep personal adversity, a stark reminder of the biases and injustices that persist in society. Yet rather than allowing this experience to define them as victims, the Carters transformed it into an opportunity for growth, advocacy, and change. Melanie's resilience shone through as she refused to let fear and humiliation silence her voice. Despite the pain of the experience, she emerged stronger, determined to stand not just for herself, but for everyone who has ever been unjustly treated. Jonathan, with his calm strength and profound knowledge of the law, stood by her side, turning the moment into a powerful example of the importance of solidarity, love, and knowing one's rights. Together, they demonstrated what it means to confront injustice head-on, with courage, dignity, and an unshakable belief in the possibility of change. Their story didn't end on the highway that day. The footage of the incident, shared by countless bystanders, went viral and ignited a nationwide conversation about policing, racial bias, and systemic inequality. It wasn't just the dramatic confrontation that captured people's attention, it was the Carters' ability to turn their pain into purpose. They became symbols of the ongoing fight for justice, using their platform to demand accountability and advocate for reforms that could prevent similar incidents in the future. For many, their story was a source of inspiration. It highlighted the power of standing up for what is right, even in the face of overwhelming odds. It reminded people that systemic change begins with individual action. Every voice matters, every act of courage counts. The Carters' experience also served as a call to action for communities across the nation to come together, challenge stereotypes, and work toward a future where dignity and respect are not privileges, but guarantees for all. As the Carters reflected on their journey, Jonathan put it best in a public address. This isn't just about us. It's about the countless stories that go untold, the lives that are disrupted every day by bias and injustice. But it's also about hope, the hope that together we can build a better, fairer society. The emotional takeaway from their story is clear. Adversity can be a catalyst for change, but it requires collective effort. It requires each of us to examine our own biases, support those who are marginalized, and demand accountability from the systems that shape our lives. The Carters remind us that progress is possible when we refuse to remain silent and instead stand united against injustice. In the end, their story isn't just about what happened to them. It's about what can happen when ordinary people come together to create extraordinary change. It's a testament to the strength of the human spirit and the enduring belief that justice, while delayed, can never be denied. Let their story inspire us all to be part of the solution.